just get started now. Thank you very much. This is the International Policy and Regulation Panel, otherwise known as Global Low-RICI, after First Minister yesterday. My name's Kirsty Hamilton. I've been somewhat stuck in the weeds for the last 2 years, it feels like, on EMR, working with the Low Carbon Finance Group. So this is a very welcome opportunity to come back to Scottish Low Carbon Investment Conference for the third time and focus on some of the European and international issues with our very distinguished panel. The focus is on transformation, but essentially we have to get down to the details of transitional steps. So what I'm going to do, because we've actually got to finish at exactly 12:30, because one of us is getting on a very low-carbon plane back to London. So I'm just going to, without further ado, give you a quick introduction. Please do look at people's bios, though, and then we're going to get straight into both the Danish example, some of the issues in the EU arena, and if we've got time, we're going to flag up some questions around the US elections, if we've got time. So to my left is Rob Hastings, Director of Energy and Infrastructure at Crown Estate. We've got Michael Timar, Partner at PwC. We've got Christian Muller, who's the Deputy Director General of the Danish Energy Agency, which is the equivalent of DEC in Denmark. We've got Colin Imrie from the Scottish Government. Won't be a new face for yourselves. He is running the international energy part inside international low carbon team of the Scottish Government, so brings both the international climate policy together with what it means on the ground. And finally, but not least, another familiar face to yourselves, Keith Anderson, Chief Corporate Officer for Scottish Power, but here in these guys is Iberdrola, an international utility, to bring that perspective forward. Getting down to the graft of transition, in particular looking at the EU debate, we've had people talking about headwinds for the last 2 days and obstacles. I don't think those headwinds are coming from one direction. That's one of the challenges. We've got headwinds around economic austerity, pressures on renewable energy targets around Europe. You've got infrastructure and concern about securing investment, actually pulling in new sources of public finance, such as the GIB, UK guarantees, Project Bond Initiative in the EU. At the same time, we're sitting in a lumpy intersection at European level between greenhouse gas policy, which is pushing you towards carbon markets and perhaps a focus on carbon capture and storage, and at the same time long-term energy policy, which has in the past pushed us towards renewables targets and system and interconnection policy. And we've also got the politics of all that. And the one country that has been held up for a long time as a success story is Denmark. And Christian is actually at the helm of the strategy behind delivering 100% renewables, which includes 100% renewables by 2050, countrywide, and 100% energy sector by 2035, which has got a microcosm of all of those economics, infrastructure, policy and politics issues. So, Christian, to you first, what are the key issues that you're dealing with at the moment to deliver on that? And what are the lessons you think that will help other people?
Okay, thanks for having me here, first of all. Well, quite a few key issues. Crash course to Danish energy policies, I guess, is that we've been at it for quite a long time. So, and with broad political consensus in the Danish Parliament. We have a minority government which has those objectives that were just mentioned, 100% renewables by 2050 in Denmark as a whole, and 100% in the energy sector by 2035, the difference being transportation, of course. That's the government's goals. Recently, in March, the Danish Parliament struck an energy agreement that is the furthest reaching and broadest based energy agreement ever in Denmark. It sets concrete policy initiatives, not goals, but concrete policies until 2020. And using those policies, we then estimate what will the effects be on renewable energy shares and greenhouse gas emissions and so on. So in effect, you have a two-prong approach. whereby you have long-term political stability in terms of 7 out of 8 parties in the Danish parliament, that's 90+% of the votes, are in favor of renewable energies by 2050. You got 7 out of 8 parties, again 90+%, that are behind the energy agreement. And that energy agreement sets out specific policies, not just goals and targets, but specific policies during the next decade that will deliver 15% percentage points hike in renewable energy targets. That will deliver a 44% decline in the use of fossil fuels in the energy sector. That will reduce energy consumption in absolute terms by 8%. And that will introduce 50% wind in the electricity sector by 2020. All of this is by 2020. And basically, that stability for the investors and those policy initiatives comes with financing mechanisms as well. So basically, it's just get out there if you're an investor, if you're a utility company, if you are anyone really involved in this sector, get out there and get it done. And you then have the broader view with where the concrete targets become goals for the future.
We don't really have time to get into lots of detail about the underlying policies and mechanisms, but one thing that underpins a lot of the themes about uncertainty over the last 2 days is political consensus. You've also been an advisor to a finance minister. How has Denmark produced the political consensus to take that long-term view that investors trust?
Well, again, I think it's actually it's on the back of years of energy policies. We developed a comprehensive energy policies after the oil crisis, so it's a gradual political approach, and that has served us well. Within government, you could say that that we have the treasury to sort of keep us from going completely off the rails and going nuts, but when you have a government that has those targets, of course the government wants to deliver on that. So as long as they keep us on our toes, that we need to actually produce good decisions. We need to be able to back them with analysis and concrete initiatives. And basically what we can see is it's driven by security of supply issues, climate change, green growth is the 3 headings. And if you're taking security of supply, is basically driven by price. And in the 70s, we spent 12-15% of GDP on energy. Now we spend 5% GDP on energy. We're getting close. My minister is getting close to that whiskey, because we reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 21% and is predicted to reduce it by 36% by 2020 due to this new agreement. So, and we have a target of 40. So we're 2 percentage points shy. And 10 years ago, our exports, 5% of our exports were energy technology exports. Today, it's 12% of our exports that are energy technology. So there's green growth, and taking that to the Treasury probably helps us a little bit.
Okay, very good. So we have to speak so quickly at this, because I think we're going to try and come back to some of the cost issues, because I think they introduce an important additional political element. But I want to turn to Keith Anderson now. Keith, Iberdrola, a company working in multiple countries internationally, has chosen to set up its headquarters for global offshore wind in Scotland, however, not Denmark. I just wondered if you can talk about your key markets internationally and what some of the regulatory features of those that make those your key markets, thinking of offshore wind here.
Sure. Thank you. I think we operate in one way, shape or form in about 19, 20 countries. The ones where we're making our biggest investments and the fastest rate of growth is really focused around 4 key areas: the UK, Spain, the US, and then South America, particularly Brazil, Mexico. The differentiators we look for and the countries that we deem to be most successful at attracting our investment are the ones who give us a long-term framework. They give us regulatory certainty. They give us stability, political stability. They give us an environment where we get a sensible rate of return. They give us an environment where we're confident there won't be any retrospective changes in terms of legislation. And as soon as we generally, as soon as we see countries move off those kind of parameters, that's when, as an investor, we start to get nervous, we start to get worried. So we look for that. And I think in many respects the UK delivers most of that. I think what then makes the difference in terms of the rate of growth and the success, if you compare to a country like Denmark, which has been phenomenally successful, it then comes to an awful lot of the other stuff that sits around that, which is, I think, making sure that the mechanisms you have in place are fit for purpose. So do they align with the types of investment you want companies to make in terms of the length of those investments, the size of them, the lead time for the investments to give you confidence. I think it's also then about some of the economic realities that sit around it in terms of maintaining political support and public support in terms of the kind of economic sustainability of what you're trying to do. And then I think the other big bit of the pie is making sure it's integrated and supported with all of your other policies. And I think that's the big trick that we've still got to resolve if you look like a market like the UK, which is your planning system absolutely aligned with the policy you're trying to drive forward? Is your grid investment system aligned? Your economic policy, your policy around jobs, manufacturing, are they all aligned to deliver the same thing as well? And I think that's where, if you look at a country like Denmark, where they absolutely got it right. I think if you go back in time and look at what Spain did, they got it absolutely right. And I think there are some other interesting examples around us now. I think if you look at the process the French government are driving forward in offshore wind, they've set themselves some very stretching targets, but they've put a package together, a very robust package together, that tries to link all of those policies and deliver that one result. And they are determined to be successful, and that creates a big competition in terms of supply chain investment, manufacturing investment. I think from our point of view, we've set our business up in the UK. We're driving it forward from the UK. We love the UK market. We get a bit frustrated sometimes that we're still seeing projects coming through where our view is there's too much of the manufacturing, the jobs and the investment still coming from abroad. We would like to see more of that come into the UK and drive that harder and faster. And to us, a lot of that is about the long-term picture, that long-term framework. So it's nice that we've got a mechanism that goes out to 2017 in terms of foresight for offshore, excuse me, which is nice. But if you look at, we made an announcement 2 weeks ago about a £20 million contract for UK companies to manufacture and produce Met-mast weather station for us. The steel will come from the UK, the design, all of the jobs are in the UK. But that's for a project in 2018, 2019. So we're starting to be asked now to invest 50, 60, 70 million pounds in projects in an environment where we don't understand what the mechanisms will be, what the policies will be, what the support will be. That's where you start to get a lot of questions and the risk of slowdown. And that's where other countries have been able to provide greater certainty and greater picture. I think Denmark, as I say, is a great example. I think Spain did it in the past as well.
Let's move on. When you're talking about the package, the EU, Colin, let me bring you in. The EU is looking ahead to what happens between 2020 and particularly 2030. They've also got the 2050 package. And that post-2020 debate is at a bit of a crossroads at the moment. From the 2020 package, where they tackled renewables efficiency and greenhouse gas targets, there's now a question about what will happen with, for example, the renewables directive. Will they move to a low carbon? Will they drive by price alone? And I wondered what that looks like to you, Colin. How do you think the EU should approach that debate, which will be becoming much more visible in 2013?
Yeah, thanks, Kirsty. And I'd just like to explain why this is important in the Scottish context. I mean, there are many reasons why I think actually there are similarities between at least the aspirations in Scotland and the reality in Denmark, in terms of there is more or less a political consensus. We've got many things going in the right direction. The government's low-carbon economic strategy, absolutely central role that greenhouse gas reductions and renewable energy will play. That's important. At the UK level, the coalition agreement sets out a very strong way forward, and in that sense, there's a lot of alignment in that level. But the European context, I think, is pretty fundamental in setting the overall framework in which these aspirations can be taken forward. European context in terms of the implementation of the global climate change agreements, where, of course, the commitment is to a 20% reduction at European level. That equates to 34% in the UK, and Scotland decided to go higher to 42%, which would have been the 30%. That's important, but also the renewable energy targets that were agreed in 2007 are absolutely fundamental in driving the approach of an integrating market with a strong renewable penetration. I mean, when I was in the European Council working group on energy back in the 90s, I argued strongly against a renewable target for the UK, but very much to the credit of Prime Minister Blair and Chancellor Merkel and others, they agreed that this was a crucial element in when Europe decided it needed an energy policy in 2007. So the goals are set, the direction is set, there are issues about the implementation and the commitment, but nevertheless it faces a legal obligation on the Member States to take it forward, and that's crucial. Now, post-2020, I mean, we're not that far away. Investment timescales for companies wishing to develop the supply chain don't stop in 2020. They're looking to see what's going to happen beyond 2020. Europe's looking very clearly at carbon reductions that go beyond the 20% level and aiming at 30%, which Scotland, Denmark, and other countries are very much sort of leading the way in that area, and the UK is as well. The difficulty we've got at the moment, I think, is that the time is not ripe to take a decision on what happens post-2020 for a series of reasons. I think big focus on getting the 2020 targets right. Don't forget the 2020 targets were only set in 2007. So effectively, for a 2030 target, the same timescale would be 2017. So there are issues there. But I think more importantly, internationally, we're in a major world economic issues. It's a downturn. This is not the time when people want to take very brave decisions about the future. And also, the climate change talks are still to reach agreement on the future. There's a very clear statement from Durban that there will be an agreement by the end of 2015, and I see absolutely no reason why that is not going to be possible, and certainly the Scottish Government is very closely involved in that. But around 2015, I think, if we get the right agreement internationally on climate change, and the developing world is far more interested now than they were back in 2009-10 in that agreement, and I think it's perfectly feasible to see us moving towards a situation whereby the decarbonisation target that the First Minister talked about yesterday will actually help drive us at European level towards a market with greater renewable penetration, other forms of decarbonisation, which will include carbon capture and storage. But also, crucially, I think, in order to deal with renewable energy, you need more interconnection and grid connections. And that's the opportunity, in many senses, for countries like Scotland, which is to position ourselves in a way where we can supply good, clean energy in increasing numbers, particularly offshore, seeing increase in our offshore wind beyond the current plans in the 2020s, and also increase in, of course, in the development of marine energy and scaling up at that point. So that's where giving certainty and clarity beyond 2020 will be important. And as I say, I think that's where, debate starting now, but it will be 2014, 2015, I think, when the actual agreements are taken.
Yeah, I think that's one thing we'll have to make sure we understand how to avoid death by announcement. When we start the debate and it takes 2 years, how do we make sure it doesn't negatively impact on people? But I think your point about interconnection, I was going to ask you about that, but because of time pressures, it's a good opportunity to bring both Michael and Robin, because some of the underlying questions around what happens when you have a more integrated system, ones where individual national governments are looking at capacity mechanisms, whether there's concerns about costs and whose consumers are going to be subsidising or paying for whose energy. So I wanted to tap in on the expertise that Michael Timar brings on this from his work on PwC, looking at the broader utilities and power sector. Interconnected, moving to a single market in Europe, are there things that we need to keep on our radar screen that are potentially either technical, difficult issues, or potentially some of those Daily Mail issues? Why is UK cross-subsidising Poland? If I can ask you that, and then I'll move on to Rob.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite interesting, I think, to understand, first of all, how high up the agenda that interconnection issue actually is. We do an annual kind of global survey of the power and utilities market, and if that covers in excess of 40 countries, and if you look at the top 3 issues that were being fed back to us by the industry, regulation was one of them, and we probably talked about that quite a bit. Secondly was planning and how you deal with that. And thirdly was the interconnection of markets. So it really was up there at the top of the agenda for companies. And I think if you're looking at the EU, and actually if you're thinking a bit beyond 2030 to 2050 and some discussion around 100% renewable energy, then actually to achieve that interconnection probably goes beyond the EU, potentially to North Africa, just because the balance of where the population is versus where the land is to actually be able to have that generation. So it is a very significant issue for each company, for each country, and I think for the investment. And therefore, to get there is potentially quite complex. There's policy there in terms of moving towards a single market, but there's agreement, I think, on some details still to come. First of all, so what models are you actually going to run? To what extent do you unbundle the assets, or to what extent can you actually just unbundle the system operation? Secondly, what model do you actually want to run to make sure that you get the investment in the right place? What form of regulation are you going to have? What way are you going to remunerate investors? These are very long-lived assets when you talk about interconnection. You're talking about 40 years plus, often much, much longer than the generation itself. So you need to be able to give whoever's investing in that quite a bit of certainty. So you need to think about to what extent do you use capacity mechanisms and maybe allow the market to drive that, or to what extent do you want a more formal form of regulation, and you see quite a bit of this in the US, where it is actually about much more focus on cost recovery, because you can then get the certainty of where that investment is going in, is actually going to go in. So you've got to think about how you actually ensure that you get that interconnected network, on a pan-European basis and potentially beyond. And then you've got the other overlay on top of that, which actually this is about connecting generation. And we've already heard about different approaches to encouraging investment in generation, renewable or other generation in different countries. They are not the same. And therefore the investors in generation are going to be making decisions based on individual countries, together with actually how the interconnected system is going to operate. So the starting point here is really going to say, what is the overall goal here? What is it you're actually trying to achieve? And therefore, through policy, how much alignment do you actually need to have? Because to have a truly integrated market, it probably needs to go beyond transmission into actually generation as well.
Well, that's quite a lot of pipes and wiring. Rob, Crown Estate, you're involved not just in round 3 and having signed the first round 3 licence, but also North Sea Countries Offshore Grid Initiative. I'm just making sure I got all the words in there, and heavily involved in the practicalities as well as investment in offshore. How does this issue look to you when you're looking at interconnection, when you're looking at what needs to be agreed so that you have flight to the UK rather than flight from the UK in terms of drawing investment in? What are the key issues here? How do you get alignment of effort between countries so that you're not getting tension but you're getting concerted movement forward?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's two dynamics to this issue. I think when you look at it, there's the one which is quite parochial, which is that, so what is the energy mix for the UK? What does it need to look like? And what is that mix that we can afford? So that's the one which seems to tax people in Treasury, George Osborne particularly, about, so what's the cost of energy for the various technologies which will provide a solution to the generation mix for the UK? So it's a parochial issue. Generally, where that takes you to is that we've got quite a lot of work to do within the UK in terms of what we're trying to do on renewables to reduce the costs of various technologies. And the one which is mostly focused on right now, for good reason, is offshore wind. So there is a target there to get that down to a number. Now that number is seen to be £100 a megawatt hour. It's a relatively arbitrary number because it's something which is specific to the UK. However, to get that, what we also know is that we need a volume of delivery which the UK would struggle alone to achieve within the timescales we've got. Because what we've done some work on, which is to look at how to reduce costs in offshore wind, what we see is that it needs to be a volume of at least 16 gigawatts by 2020 in order to get closer to the £100 a megawatt hour. So there's all sorts of risks in us being able to achieve that. So can we do it alone? Well, that's a big question. But what we could do is look at a pan-European market or a global market and say, well, actually, on a global scale, there is perhaps that opportunity to get the volumes up to the level that will actually result in the cost reductions. So then that does take you into the broader picture, which is how do we integrate more efficiently with the market across Europe, say, or maybe globally. And I think that's the area that we do need to spend a bit more time on, because what we haven't really spent an awful lot of time is, for example, is talking to Denmark and understanding how they've delivered their ambition, which was interestingly not based on targets, it's based on an idea. We want to get so much of this of our energy mix from renewables. And so that what that comes out to is the political consensus that we are lacking in the UK. So can we draw that in and just get some political consensus to say this is what we need? But there is the other physical side to this, which is that what we also know is when you've built out potentially, say, call it 10 gigawatts on Dogger Bank, the likelihood is you don't really want to just take that power to the UK. In fact, the likely economically viable solution for Dogger Bank is to interconnect with Europe. So we've already got a situation where we have to spend some time now to understand how we can integrate our activities. Physically, we can do it. We have the technology, we think, so that doesn't seem to be the issue. But when it comes down to it, is actually how is this going to work in reality, and what would the market structures look like? Because frankly, we're struggling to understand what they would look like alone in the UK with recent moves against unbundling and so on. We don't quite really understand yet how OFTOs will work in an integrated network offshore. So there's quite a lot of these sort of fundamental points which we need to just get to understand to put the framework in place, which people, investors, like Keith over there, is going to be confident to be able to step up to play and put the tens of billions that we've got to put into this.
And there is an underlying issue that I'm not sure why. Maybe you'll have actually a little comment on this, Colin, but there is an unbundling issue linked to having a financial ownership stake, which is if you're an investor that's got an ownership stake, but you're not a generator or a transmission operator, can you own transmission and generation? And the legal guidance on that is still being awaited. I don't think anyone doesn't agree with the fact it shouldn't be possible. But so although these things don't look like high-level global regulation, they are actually where things come home to roost in order to take the debate forward. Do you have any comment on the financial unbundling, or is that just something I'm interested in?
Oh, no, I think it's...
Some of the investors are.
Having been involved in the debates back in the 90s, precisely about the market power of the companies which had the integrated or vertically integrated systems, particularly in countries like Germany, one of the objectives of Europe is to create more competition in the energy market by integration. But that's not the only objective, and the objective has become to go broader than that and to actually meet our renewables and, I think crucially now, our economic goals as well. I mean, it's very, very clear at the moment that Europe doesn't want to be supporting any initiative which cuts against goes against economic growth. So I think what's interesting at the moment, and if you look at most of the big European energy companies, a large number of them are actually nationalised companies, state-owned. And it's the same in Denmark, isn't it? I think there is a state-owned companies as well. So I think a key thing in taking this forward is to make sure that there is a pragmatic approach to the regulatory structure which delivers a more competitive approach, but it also delivers the investment which is required, and that is absolutely central. And it also clearly delivers the benefits in terms of security of supply and meeting our decarbonisation targets. And in that context, having sat with the regulators actually over the last week or two, there's a lot of very, very interesting work being done at the moment across Europe in relation to the what's called the target market. The UK by 2020 will have 9 gigawatts of interconnection with other countries at least, which compared with only about 3 gigawatts. Now that will fundamentally change the UK's market operation, and exactly the same is happening in other countries as well. And in that context, this is precisely the time while we await the big decisions about post-2020 to get the framework right, to get the systems right, to get the regulatory structures right. And these things are happening. And in that context, making sure that the companies can deliver their part of the operation, while at the same time ensuring that we have the opportunity for a competitive market in the future.
Well, in our last few minutes, I'd like to just ask all of you to make a couple of final remarks. A bit of a prognosis. What are the big ticket regulatory issues, but you're not allowed to say EMR? You can allude to it, but only very briefly, on your agenda that are international. And if you've got any comments about, if there's, maybe without time to discuss it, but issues off to the side, if you're going to be glued to the telly at the US election, is that on your agenda? What are the issues that you think are going to be critical for bringing about, or that will be a microcosm of whether we're successful at bringing about that alignment between policy and investment? So I'm going to start with you, Keith.
Okay. Well, I think if you, I'll give you a couple of examples then. Based around the UK and what we're doing in the UK. And right now in the UK, we've been through a regulatory process in a networks business. And we've now committed to huge levels of future investment in a networks business. We've also made commitment to the first of the big subsea links down the west coast of the UK. We're in conversations looking at subsea link down the east coast. And what that shows to me is if you get the regulatory framework right, if you give it enough certainty and it's long-term enough, the rates of return are sensible enough, you'll get companies committing to it. And these are long-term investments, long-term investment projects, and you'll get companies doing that. And companies who are also confident that what you can also do with projects like that is go out to the external market and raise funding and financing to help deliver them. And it's how do you take that and lift that into the renewables world and give it the same kind of certainty? Because that's what you need if you want to bring in the manufacturing, the jobs, the investment, and get the real benefit out of investment in renewables and driving that forward. And the more the government, UK, Scottish government, can look at that and how do you transfer that kind of model, that kind of certainty, and bring that into the renewables world, the more you will get the upfront investment you require.
Other comments from panellists? Please.
We're in the business of promoting anything really that will provide regulatory stability over time as well as political stability. We've done so at home. We're trying to do so in Europe by targets after 2050, for instance. We have interconnectors with our neighboring countries, but we're certainly very interested in interconnectors throughout Europe in the coming years. But basically, anything within reason that will provide regulatory stability and over the longer term would be happy to back that. That's sort of that's what we think has been key to us, and we believe that's key to the EU as well.
Michael.
Yeah, probably two things. So on a global basis, the role of gas actually in the power markets and the gas debate, and you can see two different things happening because, you know, in the US, with cheap gas and a gas glut, you know, what we've actually seen some companies do is relocate manufacturing back into the US because energy is so much cheaper there now, and actually driving economic growth. I guess contrast that with the UK here, where with some of the uncertainties we haven't really, and gas prices, we haven't seen any investment in gas here, and that is having a knock-on impact, you know, at the moment on security of supply. The thing that then sits alongside that is, you know, how can you, if you like, supercharge the investment in renewable energy, and what's holding that back? There's been some discussion around cost already, and I think cost is absolutely central to that. And if you then think about regulatory policy on an EU-wide basis, I mean, nobody can say that the carbon markets have actually delivered any incentive to invest in renewable energy at all, because where the carbon price has gone. So one of the things I think we are watching with some interest is, you know, the UK has put a carbon floor in place. Actually, are we going to see that on an EU-wide basis as an alternative to carbon markets? And what impact could that have on equalising some of the cost reduction activity to supercharge the renewable investment?
Rob.
So two quite simple ones really. One is let's stop the cabinet level debate about what we're trying to achieve, which is just simply take one very, very simple lesson from what's happened in Denmark, be very clear about what we want and just do it, which I think from our exposure to the market, what's happening right now is probably the single most significant thing was destabilizing investor confidence. Second one is related in a way, it's just being pragmatic. Yes, there is a lot of complexity to what this whole market, how it works in terms of the detail of it. But when you're contemplating unbundling, for example, and how that translates into how we operate our networks, it's not let perfection be the devil of good. We just got to get it done, so let's make sure that we do something, and then if there are some challenges beyond that, we'll deal with them when we get there. Because clearly if we don't, the chances of any chances of us hitting the 2020 targets we've got are going to be seriously challenged.
Thank you. Colin.
Just one other issue, and I agree with everything. The particular approach that we've been taking in relation to reducing planning risk, I think, is something which, at a European level, really needs to be taken forward. I mean, I was in Germany earlier in the week, and there are concerns that there are massive plans for massive grid upgrades are running into concerns from public opinion about that, despite public support for the energy transition in Germany. There are similar issues elsewhere. I think a concerted focus on seeking to demonstrate how the delivery of renewable energy and grid systems is actually compatible with environmental objectives is crucial. There is not a conflict as long as you plan your systems effectively, and that's an area where there's a lot of work being done at the moment to make sure that these initiatives can actually go ahead.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to draw it to a close there. I mean, I think many of the issues, when you're thinking internationally and cross-border, are microcosms of, you know, the national issue that we've been discussing for the last couple of days. But I think a key issue is when you're looking at a transformation, you've got to have a clear objective. It's got to be shared, preferably by all government departments. And then it's a series of practical, gritty issues, some of which are going to cause a bit of turbulence and are going to be happening in the context of that. But with the right approach, we can get through it. But I certainly will be glued to the telly for the US election, particularly when I'm looking at the international agenda. So maybe next year, it'll be fascinating to pick up and see what the big issues are next year. But thank you very much to the panel. Really excellent. Pity we didn't have longer for the discussion. Thank you very much.